The pastor who played dirty in Los Angeles and got outplayed. Los Angeles is often called the city of dreams, but for my dad, it briefly became the city of nightmares thanks to one tenant from hell. My dad owns a modest rental house in LA, nestled in a quiet, suburban neighborhood. It's not a mansion or anything flashy, but it's the kind of home people dream of raising families in, bright, spacious, with a small backyard perfect for BBQs. For years, my dad rented the house without any major issues. He's always been a fair and lenient landlord, the type who wouldn't hesitate to fix a leaky faucet or extend a rent deadline for a tenant going through a tough time. That's just who he is, a good man with a generous heart. When this new family applied to rent the house, they seemed like the perfect tenants. The father was a Christian pastor, a man of God, who spoke eloquently about his faith and his commitment to serving others. His adult son also worked in a church-related capacity, and the entire family carried themselves with an air of moral uprightness. They radiated politeness and decency. "God bless you," the pastor said as they shook hands with my dad after the lease was signed. My dad felt confident he'd made the right choice. After all, who could be more trustworthy than a man who preaches integrity every Sunday? The rent that never came. The trouble started 2 months into their lease. At first, the rent simply didn't show up for 1 month. My dad, being the kind-hearted man he is, gave them the benefit of the doubt. He thought, maybe they're going through a rough patch. Everyone deserves a little grace. So, he reached out politely, asking if everything was okay. The pastor replied with a vague explanation about some temporary financial issues and promised they'd pay soon. My dad, trusting their word, let it slide. But then the second month came and went, and still no rent. This time, the excuses were even vaguer, and they started dodging my dad's calls. Texts went unanswered for days, and when they finally responded, it was always some variation of, "We're working on it, just give us a little more time." It became clear this wasn't just a hiccup. My dad, now 2 months out of rent money, was getting anxious. Owning a rental property isn't cheap, and the mortgage payments don't pause just because a tenant decides not to pay. A deal on the table. My dad finally decided enough was enough and confronted the tenants directly. He told them he couldn't let this go on any longer. They either needed to pay the rent they owed or leave the house. The pastor, ever the smooth talker, tried to negotiate. He proposed a deal. They would move out immediately, leave the house spotless, and, get this, leave behind all their furniture as compensation for the unpaid rent. My dad hesitated but eventually agreed. It wasn't an ideal solution, but at least it would allow him to move on and find better tenants. Plus, furniture could be sold to offset the losses. It seemed like a fair trade. But hindsight is 20/20, and looking back, my dad says he should have seen the red flags. The pastor had been too quick to agree to the terms, almost like he was trying to get rid of the problem as fast as possible. Still, my dad wanted to believe the best in people, especially someone who claimed to live by Christian values. Walking into a nightmare. A few days later, my dad went to inspect the house after they'd supposedly moved out. What he walked into was nothing short of a disaster zone. The house was trashed. Garbage was piled up in every corner, the smell of rotting food lingered in the air, and stains covered the carpets and walls. The walls, by the way, weren't just scuffed, they had holes punched into them. It was as if someone had taken out their anger on the property before leaving. The once pristine backyard was littered with broken furniture pieces, discarded wrappers, and even a few beer bottles, so much for leaving the house clean. And the furniture they'd promised to leave behind? Gone. Every last piece. Even the furniture that had belonged to my dad, like the dining table, chairs, and a bookshelf, was missing. The only items left behind were 2 battered sofas that had been dumped in the backyard shed, completely ruined and covered in dirt. It was clear they'd lied through their teeth. The laughing emoji that changed everything. Enraged, my dad immediately called the former tenants to demand an explanation. When they finally picked up, they were shockingly nonchalant. The pastor casually brushed off my dad's complaints, saying, "We'll pay you for the furniture in 2 weeks." Don't worry about it. To make matters worse, the son texted my dad later, adding a laughing emoji to his response. A laughing emoji. That was the moment my dad snapped. It wasn't just about the money or the trashed property anymore, it was about the sheer arrogance and disrespect they'd shown. A plan for justice. My dad knew he couldn't let them get away with this, but he also knew traditional legal channels would take time. Instead, he decided to hit them where it would hurt the most, their reputation. He knew the pastor's livelihood, and his son's, was tied to the church. So, my dad made a bold move. He called the church directly. He didn't sugarcoat anything. He explained, in excruciating detail, how the pastor had failed to pay rent, trashed the property, stolen furniture, and mocked him with a laughing emoji. He even forwarded the text as proof. The church leadership was stunned. They listened carefully and assured my dad they'd investigate the matter. From their tone, it seemed like this wasn't the first time they'd heard complaints about this pastor's behavior. My dad could tell he'd struck a nerve. The fallout. The very next day, my dad's phone started ringing off the hook. It was the pastor's son, and he was furious. The moment my dad picked up, the son launched into a tirade, accusing him of trying to ruin their lives. "What do you think you're doing, calling the church? This is unfair," he shouted. My dad, calm and collected, simply replied, "What's unfair is how you treated me," and hung up. But the son didn't stop there. He called back 10 times in a row, each call going unanswered. My dad refused to engage. Meanwhile, the church had clearly taken action. From what we later pieced together, the pastor and his son were told they needed to resolve the issue immediately or risk losing their positions. Their jobs and their reputations were on the line. Sweet, sweet justice. That evening, my dad received a call from the pastor himself. Gone was the smug, holier-than-thou attitude. Instead, he sounded desperate and apologetic. They offered to pay the full amount for the furniture, plus a little extra to cover the damages to the house. My dad agreed to back off, but only after the money was in his account. True to their word, the payment came through that same day. For my dad, it wasn't about the money. It was about standing up for himself and exposing the hypocrisy of a man who claimed to live by higher moral values. As a devout Christian himself, my dad found the whole ordeal deeply disappointing. If a pastor can behave like this, he told me, what hope do the rest of us have? It was a bitter lesson in trust, but also a victory. My dad had stood his ground, and in the end, justice was served. TLDR, Pastor Tenant in Los Angeles stopped paying rent, trashed my dad's rental, and stole furniture. After laughing in my dad's face, my dad contacted the church, who threatened their jobs. The pastor and his son scrambled to pay up, and justice was served. Don't mess with my dad. A lesson learned. After everything was settled, my dad had some time to reflect on the ordeal. It wasn't just about the financial loss or the disrespect. It was about how someone who claimed to be a spiritual leader could behave so dishonorably. My dad, being a devout Christian himself, was heartbroken. He believed in forgiveness and grace, but he also believed in accountability. Faith without works is dead, he told me one evening, quoting the Bible. What's the point of preaching morals if you don't live by them? Despite the hurt, my dad tried to focus on the positives. He managed to recover the money owed, and more importantly, he sent a clear message that he wasn't someone to be messed with. The experience also taught him to be more cautious in the future. He decided to tighten his tenant screening process, implementing stricter background checks and asking for more comprehensive references. Trust, but verify, became his new motto. What happened to the pastor? As for the pastor and his son, word around the neighborhood was that they'd been severely reprimanded by the church. While my dad didn't press for their termination, the church leadership likely realized that having someone with such a tarnished reputation in a position of authority was a liability. From what my dad could gather, the pastor was put on some form of probation, and his son quietly stepped away from his role at the church. It was a small community, and the story spread quickly. People talked. congregants whispered about the pastor's behavior, and attendance at his sermons reportedly dipped. Karma, as they say, has a funny way of balancing the scales. Moving forward, the rental house, after a thorough cleaning and some necessary repairs, was back on the market within a month. My dad made sure to document everything this time, from before and after photos of the property to a more detailed lease agreement that left no room for loopholes. He even installed security cameras outside the house to ensure he'd never be blindsided by such behavior again. It wasn't just the house that got an upgrade, though. My dad also learned to value his own boundaries more. For years, his kindness had been a double-edged sword, making him an easy target for people looking to take advantage. This experience, while painful, helped him find a balance between compassion and self-preservation. "You can forgive someone without letting them walk all over you," he said. And that's exactly what he did. An unexpected twist. Months later, my dad received a letter in the mail. It was from the pastor. In it, he apologized, not just for the financial trouble, but for the way he had treated my dad. He admitted he'd been wrong and said the experience had been a wake-up call for him. He even went on to say that my dad's decision to involve the church had forced him to confront his own hypocrisy and reevaluate his actions. My dad was skeptical at first. Was this just a ploy to smooth things over and rebuild his reputation? Or was it genuine remorse? In the end, he decided to take the letter at face value. After all, everyone deserves a chance to grow. He didn't reply to the letter, but he kept it as a reminder of the whole ordeal, a tangible piece of a story that would shape the way he approached trust and forgiveness moving forward. The moral of the story: if there's one thing to take away from this, it's that appearances can be deceiving. Just because someone claims to be a person of faith or authority doesn't mean they're beyond reproach. Integrity isn't about what you say, it's about what you do. My dad learned this the hard way, but in the end, he came out stronger, wiser, and with his dignity intact. And as for the tenants who tried to take advantage of him, they learned a valuable lesson, too. Don't mess with my dad.